A struggling mechanic fixed a billionaire's jet on the tarmac. Its owner asked to marry him on spot. Daniel's hands were stained with grease as he worked under the dim lights of the small airport hangar. He wasn't a millionaire. He didn't wear fancy suits or drive a sleek car. In fact, he didn't have much at all. He was just a regular guy, a mechanic who worked long hours fixing planes for a small airport that barely made a profit. Every day was the same for Daniel, waking up before the sun, struggling to make ends meet, and hoping that his hard work would someday be recognized. But so far, it hadn't been. Most people who walked through the hangar doors didn't even notice him. To them, he was just another cog in the machine, a faceless worker who could fix a broken wing but wasn't worth a second glance. Daniel didn't mind the work itself. He was good at it. In fact, he loved it. There was something satisfying about taking something broken, something that others had given up on, and making it work again. It gave him a sense of purpose. It was the only thing he knew how to do, and he did it well. But as much as he loved fixing planes, the truth was that life wasn't easy for him. His family was struggling too. His younger sister, Claire, was in college, studying to become a nurse. She was brilliant, always at the top of her class, but the cost of tuition and textbooks was eating away at the little money Daniel earned. He often found himself skipping meals so that she could have enough to eat, making sure she didn't have to worry about anything while she focused on her studies. She was his world, and he'd do anything to make sure she had the chance to succeed. But for all his hard work, there was never enough. He lived in a small apartment that barely fit the two of them. The rent was cheap, but it came with its own set of problems. The walls were thin, the plumbing never worked quite right, and the landlord always seemed to be breathing down their necks about something. Still, Daniel was grateful for what he had. At least he had a roof over his head, and his sister had a place to sleep at night. But sometimes, late at night, when Daniel sat alone in his tiny apartment, he couldn't help but wonder what life would be like if things were different. If he didn't have to work so hard just to get by, if there was more money coming in, if he didn't have to worry about what would happen if Claire got sick or something happened to him. One evening, Daniel sat on the edge of his bed, staring out the window at the darkened sky. His phone buzzed with a message from his sister. "Hey, Danny, I need to borrow $50 for textbooks. I'll pay you back next week." He sighed, staring at the screen. He didn't have $50 to spare. He didn't even have enough for the gas in his car to get to work tomorrow. But what could he say? He couldn't let Claire down. Not again. "Sure, no problem. I'll send it over," he typed back, forcing a smile. As soon as the message was sent, he felt the familiar weight of worry settle in his chest. Where was he going to get the money? The next morning, he woke up early, as always. He didn't have time to waste. There was a plane on the tarmac that needed his attention, and he was the only mechanic available. The owner of the plane was a wealthy businessman who often flew in and out of the airport, but he didn't care much for the workers. He was one of those people who thought of mechanics as little more than invisible service providers. As long as the plane worked, that's all that mattered. But Daniel didn't mind. He wasn't in it for the praise or the glory. He was in it because he loved the work. When he arrived at the hangar, the usual crew was gathered around the plane, talking in hushed tones. Daniel walked over, his heart racing. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to get a read on the situation. "Owner's on the way," said Jack, one of the senior mechanics. "And from the looks of it, this jet's not going anywhere anytime soon." Daniel squinted at the plane. It was a large, private jet with a sleek, shiny surface that reflected the morning sun. From a distance, it looked perfect, but Daniel knew better. There was always something beneath the surface, something that was wrong. As he got closer, he saw the issue. A crucial component of the engine had malfunctioned, something that would usually take hours, maybe even days, to fix. The other mechanics stood around it, scratching their heads. No one wanted to touch it. They were too afraid of making things worse. But Daniel wasn't afraid. He knew planes. He knew engines. He knew how to make something work when it seemed impossible. Without a word, he walked over to the plane and began to inspect the engine. The other mechanics looked at him in surprise. No one had expected him to take it on. He glanced at the tools around him, then at the engine again. It was going to be tricky, but it was possible. He just needed to think fast. Within minutes, he was already working, his hands moving quickly and efficiently, tightening bolts, rerouting wires, making adjustments. He didn't care if the other mechanics were watching or if they were doubting him. He wasn't doing this for them. He was doing it for himself, for his sister, for the chance to prove that he was more than just a struggling mechanic. As the hours passed, Daniel worked tirelessly, ignoring the heat of the day and the aches in his body. He knew that if he didn't fix this, the plane would be grounded for who knows how long. The owner would be furious, and the airport would lose money. And who knew what would happen to Daniel's job? But he didn't stop. He couldn't. This was his chance to do something that mattered. This was his moment to show the world that he was more than just a face in the crowd. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the engine roared to life. Daniel stepped back, wiping the sweat from his brow and looking up at the plane. It was ready. The other mechanics stood in awe, their mouths agape. They had been watching him, but they hadn't believed he could do it. Yet, there he was, standing tall, having completed something they hadn't thought possible. Just then, the owner of the plane stepped out of the luxury car parked on the tarmac. He was a tall man, impeccably dressed, with an air of arrogance that seemed to make the ground beneath him tremble. He strode towards Daniel, his eyes scanning the plane as he approached. "Did you fix it?" he asked, his voice dripping with impatience. Daniel nodded, his heart racing. "It's good to go," he said, his voice steady. The billionaire paused for a moment, taking in Daniel's words. Then, he smiled a smile that could only be described as genuine. "You're good," he said, before turning to his crew. "Let's go. We're flying." As the crew began to load up the plane, Daniel stood there, his mind racing. He had done it. He had fixed the jet. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was finally seen. But little did he know, this was only the beginning of a life-changing moment. The billionaire owner, whose name Daniel didn't even know yet, was about to change his life forever. As the wealthy billionaire, Mr. Grant, walked towards the plane, Daniel wiped the sweat from his forehead, still feeling the pressure of the moment. The engines had started back up, but he wasn't going to relax just yet. He had fixed the immediate problem, but there was still more to be done. He needed to make sure everything was working perfectly. The other mechanics stood off to the side, staring in awe at Daniel's work. They couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. For hours, they had been standing around, unsure of how to fix the engine problem. But Daniel had come in and, with nothing but determination and a few simple tools, had done what they all thought was impossible. Mr. Grant, who had been pacing around the tarmac, now turned toward Daniel, his hands on his hips. His cold, calculating eyes took in every detail, from the plane's polished exterior to Daniel's sweat-soaked uniform. "You think it's really safe to fly now?" Mr. Grant asked, his voice low, but with an edge of doubt. Daniel looked up, meeting the billionaire's gaze. He could see that Mr. Grant wasn't used to trusting anyone else's word, especially when it came to something as important as his private jet. But Daniel wasn't backing down. He knew this plane inside and out. "It's good to go. I checked everything twice, and the engine is working as it should. If you give it a test run, you'll see for yourself," Daniel said, his voice firm. For a moment, Mr. Grant just stood there, silently assessing him. Daniel could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he kept his posture straight, unwilling to show any signs of doubt. This was it. This was his moment. After what seemed like an eternity, Mr. Grant gave a small nod. "All right, get it ready for takeoff," he said, before turning back to his crew and instructing them to board. Daniel's hands were still shaking from the rush of adrenaline, but he had a job to do. He quickly moved around the plane, making final adjustments and ensuring everything was secure. The crew began boarding, and soon, the tarmac was filled with the sound of the jet engines revving up again. As the plane began to taxi, Daniel watched from the side, his heart still racing. He had fixed the jet, and it was flying. That was all that mattered. He had done something that, just a few hours ago, seemed impossible. But he wasn't ready to celebrate just yet. There was something in the air, something that made him feel as though this wasn't just any ordinary fix. Something told him that this was more than just a job, that his life was about to change. As the jet soared into the sky, Daniel stood there, watching it disappear into the distance. The other mechanics gathered around him, still processing what had just happened. "Man, you really did it," Jack said, a mixture of admiration and disbelief in his voice. "I've never seen anything like it." Daniel just nodded, not sure what to say. He had worked hard, given it everything he had, but he still couldn't shake the feeling that there was something bigger at play. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Daniel finished up his tasks, but his mind kept returning to the jet. He couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Grant, the way he had watched him with that calculating look in his eyes. There was something about the man that didn't sit right with him. But Daniel tried to push the thoughts aside. He had done his job. He had fixed the jet, and that should have been enough. Later that afternoon, as he was finishing up his work for the day, Daniel heard a car pull up beside the hangar. He turned to see a sleek, black limousine parked just outside. The door opened, and a figure stepped out. At first, Daniel didn't recognize her. She was tall, with striking blonde hair and a confident walk. She wore a sharp business suit that looked expensive, but it wasn't the suit that caught Daniel's attention. It was the way she moved, the way she commanded attention without even trying. The woman walked toward the hangar, and Daniel felt a sudden rush of nervous energy. His heart began to race again. Who was this person? What did she want? As she approached, Daniel finally realized who she was. It was Isabella Grant, the billionaire's daughter. He had seen her in the news before, always dressed in high-end fashion, always surrounded by a team of bodyguards and assistants. She was a powerful woman, known for her business acumen and her ability to turn any company into a success. But now, she was standing right in front of him, her eyes scanning the hangar like she was searching for something or someone. "Are you Daniel?" she asked, her voice smooth and calm. Daniel nodded, still trying to figure out what was going on. "Yeah, I'm Daniel. How can I help you?" She smiled slightly. "I heard you were the one who fixed my father's jet. You're quite the mechanic, aren't you?" Daniel wasn't sure how to respond. He was still processing everything that had happened earlier, and now, Isabella Grant was standing here, talking to him as if they were old friends. "I just did my job," he said, trying to stay humble. Isabella raised an eyebrow, clearly not buying the modesty. "You did more than that. My father doesn't just trust anyone with his planes. He's very picky about who works on them. But you proved yourself." Daniel didn't know what to say. He had never been one for small talk, and the idea of someone like Isabella Grant, someone so far removed from his world, praising him for his work felt surreal. She took a step closer, her gaze never leaving his. "You know, I'm always on the lookout for talented people. People who can think outside the box, who aren't afraid to get their hands dirty." Daniel swallowed hard, unsure where this conversation was heading. "I think you've got potential, Daniel," she continued, her tone soft but confident. "I've been looking for someone to join my team. Someone who can think like you do. I'd like you to come work for me." Daniel's mind raced. Was she serious? This couldn't be happening. He was just a mechanic from a small airport. What could someone like her possibly see in him? But before he could respond, Isabella smiled again. "Of course, there's no rush. But I think you're the kind of person who could go far. I'd like to see where this could go." Daniel didn't know how to react. This was the last thing he had expected. A billionaire's daughter offering him a job? It felt like a dream, like something out of a movie. But he didn't have time to process it. He had to focus. He had just done something incredible, and now, the doors were opening. This wasn't just about fixing a plane anymore. This was about something much bigger, something that could change everything. As Isabella turned to leave, Daniel felt a new sense of hope rising within him. The life he had known was about to change. And whether he was ready or not, he was about to step into a world that he had only ever dreamed of. The next few days passed in a haze for Daniel. He couldn't shake the feeling that something incredible was unfolding around him. It was as if his entire life had been leading up to this moment, and yet, he was still trying to make sense of it. The offer from Isabella Grant had left him reeling. What did she see in him? A mechanic who worked in a rundown airport, fixing planes no one else would touch? It didn't make sense. Every time he went to work at the hangar, he found himself distracted, his mind constantly returning to her words. He had barely slept that night, his thoughts racing through a million scenarios, most of them too grand to even entertain. Could he really work for someone like her? Could someone like him really make a life in her world? But Daniel was no stranger to hard work, and he knew that if he was going to get anywhere in life, he had to push through uncertainty. So, when the phone rang early one morning, he answered, not knowing that this call would change everything. "Daniel." The voice on the other end was unmistakable. It was Isabella. "Yeah, this is Daniel," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady, even though his heart was pounding. "I hope I didn't wake you," she said, her tone warm and inviting. "I just wanted to follow up on our conversation from the other day. My father is flying into town today, and I'd like you to meet him. It's important." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Isabella's father? He knew who she was talking about. The powerful billionaire who had more wealth than most people could even imagine. He'd read about him in the newspapers, seen him on TV. But he had never expected to meet him, let alone in such a personal way. I'd be honored," Daniel stammered, unsure of what to say. Meeting Mr. Grant felt like stepping into another world, one that Daniel had never even dreamed of entering. But there was no turning back now. He couldn't back out. Not after everything that had happened. "Great," Isabella said, her voice a bit more enthusiastic now. "I'll have someone pick you up. Don't worry about a thing. Just be ready in an hour." Before Daniel could say anything else, the call ended. He stood there, the phone still pressed against his ear, feeling his hands tremble slightly. What had he just agreed to? How could he, a simple mechanic, be in the same room as one of the most powerful men in the world? It felt surreal. But there was no time to dwell on it. He had to prepare. Daniel quickly showered, pulling on the best clothes he had, a faded button-down shirt and a pair of worn jeans. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. His reflection in the mirror showed a man who was nervous but determined. He wasn't going to let this opportunity slip through his fingers. When the car arrived, a sleek black sedan that looked like something out of a movie, Daniel felt a pang of doubt. He was used to working on planes, getting his hands dirty, not riding in luxury vehicles. But he pushed the thoughts aside and got in, trying to calm his racing heart. The drive to Isabella's estate took longer than Daniel expected. The city passed by in a blur, and soon, they were leaving behind the busy streets and heading into the outskirts, where grand homes with manicured lawns stood in quiet isolation. The air felt different here, the kind of place where people never had to worry about money, where everything was taken care of. When they arrived at the estate, Daniel couldn't help but stare. The mansion stood before him, an architectural marvel with towering columns and sprawling gardens. It looked like something out of a fairy tale, beautiful and intimidating all at once. He suddenly felt small, out of place, but he pushed the feeling aside and walked toward the front door, where a staff member greeted him with a warm smile. "Mr. Daniel, welcome," she said, opening the door for him. "Miss Grant is expecting you." Inside, the house was even more impressive. Luxurious furnishings, grand chandeliers, and walls filled with artwork that Daniel could only dream of owning. But he didn't have time to admire the decor. His eyes were drawn to Isabella, who stood near the grand staircase, a smile playing on her lips as she greeted him. "Daniel," she said, her voice as confident as ever. "I'm glad you could make it." She was even more striking in person than he remembered. Dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, she exuded an air of sophistication that made Daniel feel like he was in the presence of someone truly important. And yet, despite her status, there was something incredibly grounded about her, something that made her seem approachable. "Thank you for inviting me," Daniel said, his voice a little shaky. Isabella led him into a spacious sitting room, where a fire crackled in the hearth. The room was cozy, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong here. It was all too much: the wealth, the luxury, the sense of power that seemed to seep from every corner of the house. "So," Isabella began, settling herself into an armchair and motioning for Daniel to take a seat across from her. "I'm sure you're wondering why I asked you here today." Daniel nodded, trying to remain calm. I wasn't expecting this. I mean, the opportunity, it's a lot to take in." Isabella smiled, her eyes softening as she watched him. "I understand. It's a big leap, Daniel. But I believe in taking chances. And I believe in you. What you did with my father's plane, it was incredible. It wasn't just about fixing the engine. You showed resourcefulness, creativity, and courage. That's the kind of person I want on my team." Daniel felt a warmth spread through him at her words. He had never been the kind of person to brag about his skills, but hearing her praise him so honestly made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he was worth something after all. But before he could respond, the door opened, and a man stepped into the room: Mr. Grant. He was tall, with a commanding presence that immediately made Daniel feel small. His suit was immaculate, his posture straight, and his eyes sharp as they looked Daniel over. There was no mistaking it: this was a man who had everything. And he was looking at Daniel as if he were assessing him like one would assess a business deal. "Daniel," Mr. Grant said, his voice low but welcoming. "I hear you did quite the job with my jet." Daniel stood up, feeling the weight of the moment. "Yes, sir. I just did what needed to be done." Mr. Grant nodded, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I'm impressed. You've got a good head on your shoulders. And I like that. I think we could use someone like you." Daniel felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness at the compliment. Here he was, sitting in front of one of the wealthiest men in the world, and he was being treated like an equal. But then Mr. Grant's eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward slightly. "Now, I'm going to be honest with you, Daniel. We're looking for someone who can not only fix planes but can think outside the box, who can handle pressure and perform under difficult circumstances. If you're up for that, then we might have something to offer you." Daniel took a deep breath. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment that could change his life forever. "I'm up for it, sir," he said, his voice steady. "I'll do whatever it takes." Mr. Grant smiled, and for the first time, Daniel felt like maybe, just maybe, he was about to step into a world where he truly belonged. The days that followed were like a whirlwind for Daniel. He had barely had time to process the events of the past few days when he found himself in the midst of an opportunity that seemed too big to be true. He had met Mr. Grant, the billionaire, and Isabella had offered him a job that could change his life. Everything seemed to be happening so fast, and Daniel wasn't sure if he was ready for it. But he knew one thing for certain: his life was no longer just about fixing planes at a small airport. It was about to become something bigger, something that he had never even dared to dream of. Isabella had told him that she'd be in touch soon, but Daniel hadn't expected the call to come so quickly. That afternoon, just as he was finishing up work, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and saw Isabella's name. "Hey, Isabella," he answered, his heart racing with anticipation. "Hi, Daniel." Her voice was calm and steady, but there was an undercurrent of excitement in it. "I hope you're doing well." "I'm doing great, just trying to wrap my head around everything that's been happening," Daniel replied. He couldn't help but smile, though the nerves still gnawed at him. The whole situation felt surreal. Just a week ago, he had been struggling to make ends meet, and now, here he was, talking to the daughter of a billionaire who had just offered him a chance at something extraordinary. "I can only imagine," Isabella said. "Listen, my father and I would like to invite you to dinner tonight. There's something we need to discuss, and it's important." Daniel was taken aback. Dinner? With them? What could they possibly want to discuss? He had already fixed the plane and impressed both of them. What else could he do to prove himself? I'd be honored," he said, even though he was feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. "Great," Isabella replied. "I'll have someone pick you up at 7. We're looking forward to it." The line went quiet for a moment before Isabella spoke again. "Daniel, I need you to know that we think highly of you. You've shown incredible skill, and you've earned our respect. But tonight will be different. Just be yourself." Daniel's mind raced as the call ended. What did she mean by that? Be himself? Was this another interview? Or something more? He couldn't stop thinking about it, the questions swirling in his mind. But he had no time to overthink. He had a dinner to get to, and he wasn't about to turn it down. As the car arrived at Isabella's estate later that evening, Daniel felt the same nerves he had experienced the first time he entered the mansion. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, he wasn't just a mechanic. He was about to sit down at the table with some of the most powerful people in the world. And that thought made him feel both excited and terrified. The car pulled up to the front of the mansion, and the staff greeted him at the door. Isabella was there to welcome him, her smile warm as always. "Daniel, I'm so glad you could make it," she said, leading him inside. The dinner was already set up in a grand dining room, with candles flickering on the table and a luxurious spread of food laid out. Mr. Grant was seated at the head of the table, and he rose when Daniel entered, offering him a handshake. "Good to see you, Daniel," Mr. Grant said. His voice was deeper than before, with a hint of approval in it. "I trust you had a good day." "Yes, sir, it's been a productive day," Daniel replied, his nerves getting the best of him as he shook Mr. Grant's hand. "Thank you for having me." Isabella gestured for Daniel to sit next to her, and he did, trying to calm his racing heart. The atmosphere was more relaxed than he expected, but still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an ordinary dinner. There was something more to it, something he wasn't fully grasping. The meal began, and they talked about everything from the weather to the latest news in aviation. But no matter what they discussed, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about the reason he was here. Why had Isabella invited him? Why was Mr. Grant so interested in him? As the conversation turned to business, Isabella leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving Daniel's. "You've been doing some impressive work lately, Daniel. We've seen what you're capable of," she said, her voice smooth and confident. Daniel nodded, unsure of how to respond. He didn't want to seem arrogant, but he also didn't want to downplay his achievements. "I've just been doing my best," he said, trying to keep it humble. Mr. Grant, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. "We've been looking for someone like you," he said, his voice firm. "Someone who doesn't just follow orders, but who takes initiative. Someone who isn't afraid to get their hands dirty and fix what others can't." Daniel was surprised by his words. He had never thought of himself as someone special. He was just a mechanic, doing what he loved. But it seemed that Mr. Grant saw something more in him. "And that's why we've been considering you for a bigger role," Mr. Grant continued. "Not just as a mechanic, but as a leader. We've got projects coming up, and we need someone who can handle the pressure, who can think on their feet. Someone who can take charge when things go wrong." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. Was he hearing this right? A bigger role? But he didn't want to assume anything. "I'm honored that you think so highly of me, sir. I'm just not sure if I'm ready for something like that." Isabella smiled and placed her hand on his. "You are more than ready, Daniel. I believe in you. And I think you'll surprise yourself with what you can do." Daniel felt the warmth of her touch, and for the first time, he realized that she wasn't just offering him a job. She was offering him a chance at a new life. A life he had never imagined for himself. He had been stuck in the cycle of working long hours for barely enough money, but now, with this opportunity, he could change everything. But just as Daniel was about to speak, Isabella stood up, her eyes locked with his. "Daniel, there's something I've been wanting to say to you," she said, her voice a little quieter now. Daniel looked up at her, unsure of what she meant. He had never expected this conversation to take such a personal turn. "I've been thinking about what you did for my father's jet," she continued. "And I've realized something. I don't just want you to work for me. I want you to be part of my life. Not just as a colleague, but as something more." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Isabella's expression softened, and she took a deep breath. "I'm offering you more than just a job, Daniel. I'm asking you to marry me. Right here, right now." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Daniel didn't know how to react. This was the last thing he had expected to hear. A proposal? From Isabella Grant? "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Isabella smiled, her eyes shining with something he couldn't quite place. "I've never been more serious in my life. You've shown me everything I've been looking for, Daniel. Strength, humility, intelligence, and heart. I don't want to wait any longer." Daniel stood there, speechless. His mind was racing, and his heart was pounding in his chest. Could he really marry someone like Isabella? Someone so rich, so powerful, so different from the life he had known? And yet, he felt something inside him stir, something he had never felt before. Maybe it was love. Maybe it was something else. But whatever it was real. He looked into Isabella's eyes and saw something he hadn't expected: trust. A trust that she was offering him a life he had never imagined, and a chance to be someone more than he had ever thought possible. "Yes," Daniel said, his voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." Isabella's face lit up, and for a moment, everything else faded away. This was his new beginning. The life he had been waiting for had finally arrived. The days following the dinner with Isabella and Mr. Grant felt like a blur. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that his life had shifted on its axis. One moment, he was a struggling mechanic at a small, run-down airport, trying to make ends meet, and the next, he was engaged to a billionaire's daughter, about to step into a world he had never imagined. It felt unreal. The proposal had taken him by surprise, and yet, looking back, he realized that in some strange way, he had always felt a connection to Isabella. It wasn't just about the wealth or the power that surrounded her. It was about the way she saw him, truly saw him, not just as a mechanic, but as a person with potential, someone who had something to offer. Daniel had never considered himself much more than the work he did. But now, Isabella was offering him a chance to be more, to step into a life filled with opportunities he had once only dreamed about. It was overwhelming, and yet, for the first time in his life, he felt like he was on the cusp of something bigger. The wedding was planned quickly. Isabella didn't want to wait, and neither did Daniel. There was no need for a long engagement. They both knew what they wanted. The ceremony was small, just a few close friends and family, but it was beautiful. Isabella wore a simple, elegant gown that made her look like something out of a fairy tale, and Daniel, in a suit that still felt a bit unfamiliar to him, stood by her side, still trying to grasp the reality of the situation. As they exchanged vows, Daniel couldn't help but think about everything that had led him here. He had come from humble beginnings, from a life of struggle and uncertainty, and now he was marrying the woman he loved, someone who had seen him for who he truly was. It felt like a dream, one he wasn't ready to wake up from. Isabella's father, Mr. Grant, was there, of course, and he gave Daniel a nod of approval, though it was clear that he was a man of few words. He had always been a bit distant, but Daniel could see the pride in his eyes. Despite their differences in background, Daniel knew that he had earned Mr. Grant's respect, and that was enough for him. After the wedding, they left the small venue in a sleek black car, heading to a private villa on the outskirts of the city. It was a place that Isabella had chosen, a quiet, peaceful retreat away from the chaos of the world. It was here, in this secluded paradise, that they would begin their new life together. As the days passed, Daniel found himself adjusting to his new life. The luxury, the wealth, it was all so different from the life he had known. He spent his days working with Isabella's team, handling various projects for the company, and learning everything he could about the business world. Isabella was patient with him, always encouraging him to trust his instincts and take on more responsibility. She believed in him, and that belief made all the difference. But it wasn't just the work that was different. It was the way Isabella treated him, the way she made him feel like he truly belonged in her world. She never looked down on him for his past, never made him feel out of place. Instead, she celebrated the qualities that made him who he was: his work ethic, his honesty, his determination. The transition wasn't always easy. There were moments when Daniel felt overwhelmed, when he wondered if he was really cut out for this life. The people around him, the high-powered executives and business leaders, often seemed so polished and confident, while he felt like an outsider, still learning the ropes. But Isabella was always there, offering her support and encouragement. She would remind him that he didn't have to be perfect. He just had to be himself. And slowly, Daniel began to believe her. One afternoon, as they sat on the balcony of their villa, looking out over the ocean, Daniel turned to Isabella. "I never thought this life was possible for me," he said quietly, his voice filled with awe. "I never thought I'd be here, with you, in this world." Isabella smiled, her eyes soft with affection. "You don't have to be anything other than yourself, Daniel. That's what I love about you. You don't need to change for anyone. You've always been enough." Those words, simple as they were, meant more to Daniel than anything else. It was a reminder that, despite all the wealth and power surrounding them, it was their connection that mattered most. She didn't care about his past or his background. She cared about who he was at his core. Over time, Daniel's confidence grew. He became an integral part of Isabella's team, using his skills and ingenuity to help solve problems and improve operations. He was no longer just a mechanic. He was a leader, someone who could make decisions and influence change. The people who once overlooked him now sought his advice, and Daniel was more than ready to give it. The work was challenging, but it was fulfilling. Daniel found himself excited about the future, eager to see where this new path would take him. He wasn't just building a career, he was building a life, one that was filled with purpose and meaning. But the greatest change wasn't in his career. It was in his personal life. Daniel and Isabella had settled into a routine, one that was built on mutual respect and understanding. They supported each other, and their relationship grew stronger with each passing day. Daniel had never believed in fairy tales. He had always thought they were for other people, people who were born with silver spoons in their mouths. But now, as he sat beside Isabella on their balcony, watching the sun set over the ocean, he realized that maybe, just maybe, fairy tales weren't as impossible as they seemed. Isabella had brought him into her world, but more than that, she had brought him into her heart. And in return, Daniel had given her his love, his trust, and his loyalty. Together, they had built something that was more than just a marriage. They had built a partnership, one that was grounded in love and respect, and that was worth more than any amount of money or power. As the months passed, Daniel continued to grow in his new role, proving to himself and to others that he was capable of so much more than he had ever imagined. The man who had once been a struggling mechanic was now someone who commanded respect in his own right, someone who had the confidence to take on any challenge that came his way. But through it all, he never lost sight of where he came from. He never forgot the days when he had struggled, when he had worked long hours just to make ends meet. And he never forgot the people who had supported him along the way: his sister, his co-workers, and of course, Isabella. Isabella had shown him that it was possible to have it all: love, success, and happiness. She had given him a chance to live a life he never thought possible, and in doing so, she had changed his world forever. As they stood together, looking out at the stars one evening, Daniel took a deep breath and smiled. He had everything he had ever dreamed of. But more than that, he had something even more important: someone who loved him for who he truly was. And that, he realized, was the greatest gift of all.